Hello and welcome to Critical Readings, episode 336 for the 17th of August, 2026. I'm Dr. Sean Philip Cooper, and with me today I have Lane Haygood.
Hello.
And Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene.
Salutations.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Well, today we are going to be looking at the first of 3 episodes on the final book in The Once and Future King by T.H. White, and that is The Candle in the Wind. A song by Elton John, too, isn't it, I think?
Yes.
It is, yes, so. May have come a little later than T.H. White's 1940 novel. So
that's an interesting thing. 1940 is when it was written.
Yes.
Which is the same year that Ill-Made Night was published.
Correct.
But this is the only one, as best I can tell, that wasn't ever published as a standalone. It was not published until 1958 in the collected Once and Future King.
That's right. It didn't get a standalone. And I think when he'd finished it, White started work on or was considering work on the 5th book, the Book of Merlin. And that, of course, never got published. And then that got reworked in the Once and Future King when The Candle in the Wind was originally published. So here they are. They're all bound up. And so this is kind of the natural conclusion to the story, although we must remember that when White was writing it, he was thinking of including or having another story, right? He was thinking of doing something else.
It's also, I didn't quite realize that the musical Camelot is 1960. So that's only 2 years after this was published.
It was fresh in the mind.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, it's The Candle in the Wind that really provides a lot of the action for the musical. So you can see why Lerner and Lowe would have looked at it and said, this book has just come out. Let's go ahead and write this. So I was struggling with this earlier because I didn't realize that it wasn't originally published as a standalone book. And so I asked, Lane and I were discussing it. I said, there's like 20 years between The Sword and the Stone and The Ill-Made Night. And I found that, in fact, they were written 2 years apart. But they were published a good long way apart. Okay, well, let's get to it then. So The Candle in the Wind begins not with Lancelot and Guinevere, which is where we might suspect it would begin, because that's kind of the unresolved question mark from The Ill-Made Night, right? She becomes a raving woman for a bit, and then things are smoothed over, and Lancelot has got his mojo back, we might suspect, having defeated Sir Mador de la Porte, and then Sir Meliagaunt, and then healing Sir Uri. Surely we must now turn our attention to Lancelot and Guinevere. And we do, but we don't turn it directly at them. Instead, we begin The Candle in the Wind where we began the second book, and it's with the Orkney boys, Mordred and Agravaine. And I think that the reason White does this is because he has them stepping forward in the end of the Ill-Made Night, right? They step forward. And if you're not a sophisticated reader and you don't really know what's going on, then maybe you need White to explain it to you, and that's what he's doing here in The Candle in the Wind. Why did they step forward? So they can take center stage in the beginning of The Candle in the Wind. And what a stage it gives us. Fat, drunk Agravaine. But eminently more practical. Have you noticed? So Mordred is a revolutionary. He's like a Jacobin. He's got high abstract notions. They're evil notions, but they're cloaked in the language of universal struggle, which makes them seem appealing. It's about freedom, right? It's about representation. And as Agravaine points out, no one's going to die for your abstract notions. You need something practical.
Mordred Robespierre.
Yes.
And also White makes the evil of Mordred seem ethnic.
Yes.
Genetic. He says, it's savagery and feral wit of the Pict. That's where it comes from.
Indeed. Well, I wonder about this Mordred too, because there's something deliberately affected about it. Like Mordred, you get the sense he doesn't really care about any sort of ethnic struggle, and he certainly doesn't care about notions of freedom or liberty or equality, right? These are convenient tools of manipulation that can be used as a sort of fig leaf to cover up the sort of malevolence that's inside of him that really motivates him. Whereas
We wonder if Mordred is perhaps being influenced here by the reception of Stalin
it's a good point. Yeah, I think
in
maybe
early World War II Britain.
Could be.
Yeah.
I mean, this would have been about the same time Orwell would have been having his disenchantment with Stalin and Stalinism.
Well, indeed, 10 years before he wrote 1984, in fact. So, and he's writing, when is Orwell writing Animal Farm? A little later, is it before 84 or after 1984?
I thought it was after 84,
Yeah,
but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Isn't he writing it while he's dying on that miserable little island on his typewriter? I think that's what's going on. I'm not a scholar of Orwell, but I think that's what's happening. So he's writing that in the 1950, I want to say 1951, something like that. In any case, so this is certainly in the era of the British literati are thinking about totalitarian societies, fascist societies, communism explicitly. And there's a growing disenchantment in the mid-20th century during and certainly in the wake of the Second World War. I think T.H. White is absolutely participating in that. And it's got to be behind Mordred to some extent. Because there's nothing of this in White, right? This whole idea of nationalism and stuff, it's purely 20th century politics that White has brought in to his depiction of the Arthurian conclusion. So... And that part of that is necessary because Mordred in Malory, because it's such a chronicle influenced text, there's no real motivation for Mordred being the way he is. There's no psychologization of Mordred, but there's a good deal of it in White, especially in the chapters we're coming to, some of which are my favorite bits of writing in all literature. Lane and I were discussing before the podcast that White's gifts as a prose stylist improved over time, and The Candle in the Wind is probably his most gifted work of these four for that reason. His prose is incredible, really, really good. It also go ahead.
The concept of nationalism that runs straight through the Once and Future King is completely out of step with anything in Malory. Malory doesn't have a concept of nationhood, nation states, that sort of thing. This is very 20th century in its perspective.
That's right. I mean, the idea of a nation won't arise until
The Peace of Westphalia.
Yeah, really. It's much later. I mean, you get some glimpses of it here and there. So, for example, when Elizabeth I is giving her speech, right? And she's prancing about on her horse in her breastplate and talking about, how she, not Spain nor Parma, right? No, well, there's a certain sense of nationalism there, proto-nationalism in the Tudors. But not really. I think you're right. I think you're quite right, Lane. Not really. The idea of modern nation states are still centuries removed. And Malory's writing this in the mid-15th century. He's reading French sources. Many of the most literate people in the court speak French still. English is now dominant, but still most people speak French. Mallory spoke French and didn't think anything of it. It was, they were fighting against the French, but they didn't think anything of speaking French and even having certain French customs. It was just geography they were fighting over, really.
It's no problem in a feudal system for the person who inherits the crown of England to also have inherited duchies and counties in what we would call France.
Mm-hmm.
In a feudal system, it is about the inheritance, and it is about the network of loyalties that you have. Whereas by the time you get to the early modern period, the idea that the King of France would have the King of England as one of his vassals, and that the King of England might control more of France than the King of France does, mm-hmm. is complete, nonsense. But that's the point at which a concept of nation state, once that no longer makes sense, you're starting to replace feudalism with nation states.
Exactly. So Mordred is a sort of embodiment of this idea of nationalism, which White, I suppose, would identify with modernity, kind of rising up to tear down the medieval Arthurian way of life.
We know here what White thinks about the cause of Scottish independence.
Or Irish independence.
Or independence at all. Let's not have any. I do want to actually point out here, though, that this is a place where White has been sensitive to Drew's concerns. So over the past few weeks, Drew has called our attention to the fact that White's picture of the medieval era is often a rather rosy one and a romantic one, which White sort of admits, but he admits in such a way that he'd like you to forget it.
Yeah.
Yes, that's all the case. Now let's move on with our story, and then you'll forget it. But he does spend a good chapter here cataloging the disastrously brutal realities of medieval life. The tortures inflicted on peasants and ordinary people and serfs. And I wonder why he does this so late in the game. And I can only conclude that it's sort of, we want to put it in proximity to people like Mordred and Agravaine, right? That
yes, and he wants us to get the sense that within a limited scope of time, Camelot and the Round Table and that vision worked. But now it's falling apart. And it's falling apart because of its association with the Orkney people, right? But so now it's okay to describe everything that's gone wrong because the myth is breaking apart.
Now, he does this in a way where he characterizes all of the real monarchs as fictional, right? Or imaginary or made up. These are the words he uses, like the totally fictional Louis XI, the completely imaginary Richard II, right? I mean, so he's playing with us, right? But I think that there's a sort of some truth bubbling away underneath this, which is that White has, he's an excellent medievalist, and he has an absolute knowledge that things were not rosy and romantic in the medieval era. And yet there's something in him that still wants to romanticize that period of time. And there's this internal conflict is always kind of rumbling away just out of sight in the Once and Future King.
It's like if you've read C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the very last chapter, he says, you can probably tell that I have a great deal of affection for this world picture. And while that's true, I have to acknowledge that it is false. This picture isn't reality. But he really wants it to be.
Yes. I mean, doesn't it make a better story if we can kind of fool ourselves into believing it just for a little bit, right? The suspension of disbelief in historical reality is what we need. We need to set it aside and bracket it for a moment, because then it makes the story so much more compelling. It makes Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere so much more compelling. It makes Mordred and Agravaine so much more wicked for tearing it down and replacing it with the banality of modernity. But of course, it's
The-
not true.
Incidentally, the musical Camelot does this exact thing in the form of the song "Fie on Goodness," where we see that all the knights are pining for the days in which they could exploit people and rape and pillage and do all the nasty things they were doing. And Arthur has sort of been suppressing that. And as Arthur's power wanes and he gets wrapped up in his own love triangle situation, all of this comes up again.
That's right. And who are the most wicked knights? Who leads Fie on Goodness? Mordred, right? We don't actually get a good deal of Agravaine in Camelot, do we? He's kind of
No,
shunted
he's not a
out.
character at all.
Yeah, he's not a character at all. But I think what White shows us here is that you have to have both of them, right? They would have failed if they weren't working together. Mordred alone is too academic. His head is, he's got all these abstract ideas. He has no way to connect them to ordinary people because he's not an ordinary person. He's some sort of, wispy, nebulous intellectual. Agravaine, on the other hand, is a
fat drunk,
and he has no ambition, right? He has no range to his malevolence. He, as I think White says, it's just reactive. So he kills his mother, right? Because he catches her in bed and she's immediately to hand. He can do it. But like his evil can't really get beyond arm's reach. He just doesn't have the planning or the noose to really think about putting all the pieces together to really get his revenge on Lancelot. Maybe if he caught...
Not a strategist.
Yeah, no strategy, right? Maybe if he caught Lancelot, in a corridor in a dark night and he was armed and Lancelot wasn't, maybe then he would murder him. But to plot it out or do what was necessary to plan it or to bring down Lancelot, some sort of grand scheme, totally beyond Agravaine. He's too busy drinking, right? From the moment he wakes up in the morning. Mordred never drinks. That's they're complete opposites in a way, but they're both motivated by the same hatred of, essentially, the hatred of the Arthurian system. Although,
and yet it's Agravaine who gives us the political theory here.
Yeah, they don't really realize that they hate the system either. They hate individuals, but the hatred of individuals, I argue at least, is that it's a stand-in for their hatred of the system. They don't really know how to hate the system, but they can hate certain people, right? And so all their hatred in the system kind of gets piled on that individual. Because there's no reason for Mordred to hate his father, as White points out, right? White says, look, Arthur's done everything he can for this boy. He's treated him kindly. He's brought him to court. He's been conscientious towards him. Yes, there was the regrettable incident with the boats where he tried to have him killed. But that was at Merlin's direction, remember, in Mallory. I don't think White tells us that, but that was Merlin told Arthur to do that. That's what excuses him in Mallory. And Arthur repents of it in White. So what's the problem? Well, there's only a problem if you can conceive of systemic biases and hatreds, which White gives us in the form of Mordred's political theories and Pictish clan loyalties and blood feuds against Lancelot and the Pelennors and Lamorak and all that, right? Kind of is designed to give us animus.
He doesn't... I mean, it's very clear that White, because of the way he's depicting this conversation about their personal hatreds getting a political dress, that White thinks that all of the causes of his own time are not really motivated by what they say they're motivated by. That he thinks that these are all just covers.
Well, that's right. That the disunity of the period is actually driven by sinister forces that have a malign plan, and that's what he puts in the mouth of Mordred and Agravaine. So here's Agravaine talking. What would happen if we were to denounce Sir Lancelot personally under these new fashioned laws so that the king was forced to investigate? So the trial by combat is out at this point. That's in the past now. Everyone's getting old, right? They're in their mid-50s and older. Lancelot and Arthur's much older. If Agravaine is 55, Arthur's probably 60, maybe even older still. What would happen then? Well, I can't see that anything could happen except a split. Arthur depends on Lancelot as his commander and the chief of his troops. That is where his power comes from, because everybody knows that nobody can stand against brute force. But what if we could make a little merry mischief between Arthur and Lancelot? Because of the queen, their power would be split. Then would be the time for policy. Then would be the time for discontented people, lollards and communists and nationalists and all the riffraff. Then would be the time to take your famous revenge. Lollards and communists.
And nationalists, which basically means anyone that is opposed to an oppressive system who is rebelling against it, right? A nationalist opposing an imperial colonial power, the Lollards opposing the Catholic hierarchy, the communists opposing the bourgeois liberal capitalist, any of that, they don't really mean it. They're not serious about what they say they're serious about. They really are just nasty people.
The rebels, Drew. They're rebels. And traitors. And you know what happens to traitors? Well, they're just waiting to act. And Mordred is going to use them. And so that's the plan, right? So Agravaine and Mordred come up with this together. And again, I really can't stress this enough. You have to have them both in White's vision of this. Now, Mallory, of course, doesn't give us their motivations. This whole thing doesn't exist. This motivations for people in Mallory are often reducible to a single sentence. And in the case of Mordred and Agravaine, it's that they're unhappy. That's it. You know, there were two unhappy knights. Mallory tells us. He doesn't tell us why they were unhappy, just that they were. Right. We know they don't like Lancelot. And we know they don't like the fact he's carrying on with Guinevere, but we don't exactly know why they don't like that or what their personal stake in it is. Here, we get to see that they have long-standing grudges that go way back, and they would like to venge themselves on Lancelot. Well, in Chapter 2, the rest of the Orkney lads come in. Gawain, Gareth, and Gaheris. Now, you may remember, if you've been paying attention, that Gareth was personally trained by Lancelot, knighted at Lancelot's own hands. And Gaheris is very favorable to Lancelot. And Gawain, who is the leader of the family, he doesn't dislike Lancelot, right? You get the sense he's probably not super thrilled about Lancelot and Guinevere. But Gawain also recognizes power, and Lancelot is the most powerful knight, and Gawain respects that. And if you want to win battles, you want someone like Lancelot on your side, and Gawain understands that. So these three brothers are not like Mordred and Agravaine. They range from, being neutral, leaning positive to full-on embrace of Lancelot, and they don't want anything to do with this awful, awful plan. And Gawain tries to stop them, and a fight almost breaks out. And it reminds me of the fights they have back in Book 2, right? When they're at each other's throats and they're arguing and they're nasty to each other, scrabbling and scrawling. Except now they're grown-ups, and they're drawing swords on one another and threatening each other. And it's in this moment that the king comes in. An old man at the end of this chapter. He looked older than his age, which was considerable, which reminds us of how this book begins, which is that Agravaine had looked his age since he was 40, which was 55. He hasn't changed in 15 years. He's always looked 55. He was seldom sober. sort of the opposite of Arthur, but also they both look older. It's the cares in Arthur's case. It's the alcohol in Agravaine's case that wear on them and age them prematurely.
I mean, it's hardly premature for this time.
Oh, no. Yeah, 55 in, well, when is this set? We don't know. 1216, 1066, 895. It's
Agravaine references John Ball, so that's mid 14th century.
Yeah, exactly. We're just jumping all over the place, right? What I think is interesting is White does a really great little narrative trick here, right? They're ready to start stabbing and fighting and killing each other, the Orkney boys, just as Arthur steps into the room and everything is suspended like a Rembrandt painting, right? Everything is held in the moment. And then here's where we expect Mordred and Agravaine to, charge Lancelot before the king. And we're not going to see that. We're going to shift focus now. So this cliffhanger is left. We're left on the side of the cliff. And we're going to go look at Lancelot and Guinevere, who are going to be the subject of them. And what are they doing? They're singing this French song to each other. And we get a sort of little bit of shade being thrown against Tennyson, which I think is unjust, but here it is. An observer of the present day who knew the Arthurian legend only from Tennyson and people of that sort would have been startled to see that the famous lovers were past their prime, as if Tennyson can't depict old people. I think is rather unkind. I think that the Mort Arthur that we get in Tennyson is... Think about Arthur at the end of... think about the death of Arthur in Idylls of the King, right? He feels even older than the Arthur here in The Once and Future King. He feels completely spent.
Yeah. No, I think Tennyson's a better retelling of Mallory than White.
Yeah, right. So it's rather unkind to accuse White accusing Tennyson of being a romantic is a bit rich. That's that's all. That's all I'll say about it. I mean, I love both of them as authors, but come now. Here's some of those little pointers to the reality, such as it is. Right, Uther the Conqueror gets another mention here, but also legendary kings like John had been accustomed to hang 28 hostages before dinner. And then, I underlined it and now I've lost it. Mythological families such as Plantagenets, Capets, and so forth. So we have this potted history of the Dark and Middle Ages, which White exclaims later on is the impudent way that the 19th century had with its labels. And I think maybe that's why Tennyson is coming in for critique here. He's decided to critique 19th century historiography, these Dark and Middle Ages. Because then he points out, under the window in Gramarye, the sun's rays flamed from 100 jewels of stained glass. I mean, yes, they're not literally dark and middle, but think about the history that White has just given us. It's one of absolute brutality. The story he tells here, finds the good men of the house repeating the prayers used at sea on the approach of storm and ending with the plea, "The Lord bless us and help us," to which all present had replied, "Amen." Because that was it. That was the limit of your hope. You hoped that your barren local lord was a good one. And if he wasn't, there was no recourse. And your life could be very, very awful indeed. Elaborately creative cruelty married with an absolute indifference to the value of human life, and a total disconcern for people beneath one's own station. And White seems to be perfectly willing to admit this, and then to turn around and say, but the Dark Ages weren't dark and miserable.
Well, he's being a bit imprecise too. I mean, nobody's using the term Dark Ages to describe the High Middle Ages. They're using it to describe the early Middle Ages, whereas
Indeed.
the stained glass he's talking about is not a product of early medieval Europe. It's the High Middle Ages, which nobody calls Dark Ages.
And we have to be careful too, because I mean, so the term the Dark Ages has fallen into some disrepute.
As well it should.
As it should, right? It refers rather disparagingly to the period post fall of the Roman Empire. So you're looking at like the 6th to 9th centuries, roughly, right, up to Charlemagne. When, as Sir Kenneth Clark pointed out in his series Civilization, there was a point where European civilization looked like it might not recover. That doesn't mean it wasn't producing things of elaborate beauty, though, which is why the term Dark Ages has fallen out of favor. People have said, well, look at all these wonderful things that were being made. And eventually we did recover. We recovered classical learning, and that allowed us to kind of lift ourselves up out of the Dark Ages. And so they weren't really so dark after all. I think that's all perfectly...
Well, I think it's a misunderstanding of what the Enlightenment thinkers are the ones who created that terminology. But they were talking primarily about access to texts.
Exactly.
Dark because they didn't have access to all of the ancient learning anymore. That was still available in the East, but they were cut off.
Very Eurocentric. Baghdad and Jerusalem had plenty of universities and texts.
Well, that's it exactly.
Right. I mean, the periodization that the French Enlightenment thinkers set up is a history of Europe, not a history of the world. But that's what they meant by dark, is that Western Europe no longer had access to the texts of the classical period.
And so we shouldn't generalize out from that everything was hopeless and
right.
That there was, I mean, people had their political, goals. We get Clovis, we get Greater Francia, we get Charlemagne out of that period. So people certainly had ideas about political unity and about building to last, building stable societies, ensuring that justice as they understood it would be done. So it's not really dark in that sense. So I don't know that it's entirely impudent, except
all the migration period, the Goths, the very Normans came to France during this period. So
that's it exactly. So, but I think Drew is right that then he does a little sleight of hand, right? Like, okay, now we're going to talk about stained glass. Well, yes, but that's not a product of the 8th century. That's a product of the 10th and 11th and 12th century, the High Middle Ages, as we would call it today.
Well, as ever, White's chronology is all over the place. I think that you made an interesting point. I've been percolating on this about White chastising Tennyson for romanticism.
Yeah.
Which is, as you say, a bit like the pot calling the kettle black. But I think what allows White to accept his own romanticism better than Tennyson's is that Tennyson's romanticism is without any tinge of irony. Whereas for White and people like White, their romanticism is protected by the fact that they make fun of their own romanticism.
Yes.
It's still there, but they do it ironically.
Yes. Which begs the question, I shouldn't say that, which inspires us to ask, because it doesn't beg the question, that has a specific meaning. Inspires us to ask then, is Tennyson really unaware, or does he just consider that inessential to his story? And I don't think that Tennyson was unaware that the medieval era wasn't all light and roses and stained glass windows and young people. But that's not essential to the kind of story he's telling, which is about capturing a certain kind of emotional, picturesque view of things. Is it essential for Tennyson to remind us that Lancelot and Guinevere are old? I mean, it's not really the kind of it's not the kind of story he's telling. It doesn't add anything to it. So why?
Nor is it the kind of story that he's adapting either.
No,
it's not
that's absolutely right. Mallory doesn't. Nobody's age gets mentioned, right? Mallory isn't constantly reminding us. None of the sources are constantly reminding us how old Lancelot and Guinevere are, because they exist in a timeless realm. Right? Nobody ever gets older. It's like being on an episode of The Simpsons. Nobody ever gets older. Nobody ever graduates to the next grade. Right? Everyone's the same age forever, because they're romances.
And they always wear the same outfit every day.
Exactly. Everyone dresses the same, and they do too. Right? They all got the same shields. Nothing changes until it all ends, and then time resumes. Which is, I think, one of the things that's so jarring about White is that time does pass in his universe.
How often do we have these discussions in the history of literature between romanticism and realism? And that's essentially what White is giving us here, and he's making the case for realism, but I think that misunderstands why romanticism became a thing in the first place, because it's like you don't have to have explicit realism to tell something true and meaningful and beautiful.
It also, it highlights how incredibly difficult a task it is to make Mallory into a text that has any semblance of realism.
Yes.
Like, this isn't realistic. It has bits of realism kind of shoved into it, but it's not realistic.
It's mythic.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, part of that is because Mallory is really a knight, and he has real experience with tournaments and jousts and things. And so real details of these things do make it in. But those aren't actually the things that matter in the story. They give color to it and a sense of the real, but they're not the things that matter. The things that matter are all completely unreal. I mean, Uther being turned into the Duke of Cornwall for a night so he can, have relations with Agravaine, and then the child being spirited off by Merlin. It's like, these things are completely fantastical. Margot's disguising herself. So poisoned apples, holy grails, mystic quests, those are the things that actually matter, and they're the things that aren't real. So you're quite right, Drew. It's a challenge to mistake, I think, the real details for Mallory as a sign that the work is a realistic one. And therefore it should be easy. It should be easy to simply adapt it for modern audiences accustomed to the real. Chapter 3 begins with Lancelot and Guinevere, but quickly goes off the rails and is not occupied with Lancelot and Guinevere at all. It's occupied with the Dark Ages and then the Light Ages, and how they're one and the same, according to White. Chapter 4 gets back to Lancelot and Guinevere. They're still sitting in the solar window, and they're singing a song. They're completely in love. And any of the mad jealousy of the ill-made knight is gone now. It's not there. White says they've both softened a little, or they've become set in their sort of maturity. This is the chapter where White tells us that Lancelot's ugliness kind of solidifies into something reassuring. The ugliness of a bulldog, he says, which is reassuring because it's a symbol of strength and it's there to defend you and you can lean on it. It's not frightening. It's reassuring. I wonder, though, if the reason for this is that because Guinevere's victory over Lancelot, sort of her subjugation of him, is complete. Right? And so there are no rivals anymore. There's no holding back for God. There's no Elaine in a far-off castle. There's no Galahad to remind her And Arthur is an old man and he's looking the other way, and nobody at court brings it up. Everybody knows, but nobody brings it up because Lancelot has killed Meleagant, who raised that charge. And you know that, he can do the same thing to you still. That's why he's like a bulldog. You don't make those kind of charges. And anyway, there's no real evidence of it, even if you wanted to bring him in under those newfangled laws, as Mordred says. You don't have any evidence of it. It's just, as Mallory says, rumor and noise, right? So
the exchange here shows kind of really well how the situation has completely changed. The two of them sitting together, and Lancelot says, "May I come tonight?" "No." "Why not?" "Lance, please don't ask. You know that Arthur is at home and it's much too dangerous." "Arthur won't mind." "If Arthur were to catch us," she said wisely, "he would have to kill us." He denied it. "Arthur knows all about us. Merlin warned him in so many words, and Morgan le Fay sent him 2 broad hints. And then there was the trouble with Sir Meliagrance. But he doesn't want to have things upset. He would never catch us unless he was made to." "Lancelot," she said angrily, "I am not going to have you talking about Arthur as if he were a go-between. I am not talking about him like that. He was my first friend, and I love him. Then you are talking about me as if I were worse. And now you are behaving as if you were. Very well. If that is all you have to say, you had better go. So that you can make love to him, I suppose. Lancelot!" This is how the situation has changed.
yes. And you know what? There's a certain truth to what Lancelot is saying. He's not wrong. He's not lying. I mean, Arthur does know all about it, but he doesn't want to know about it.
Which means he won't ever expose them or catch them unless someone makes him.
And that's
do
what
it, which is
Guinevere,
kind of
what if
the whole
someone
thing.
forced him? That would be the only way. If someone forced him. Well, there's your literary foreshadowing, listeners. What if somebody forced him? Well, in chapter 1, Mordred and Agravaine came up with a plan to do exactly that. What if we put it before the king? Then that would cause a split, right? Some merry mischief, they said, between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot. That could only cause a split. And the split would be because this is the way that White has constructed this narratively. It's not in the sources, but it works for what he's done. If Arthur has abolished trial by combat and everything is now laws and evidence, then if you make this accusation and you have evidence, then you don't have to fight Lancelot. There's not going to be any trial by combat. He'll simply be found guilty. He'll be executed. Guinevere will be executed. They'll finally get their revenge on Lancelot.
And this factors into the concept of law as abstraction or something mechanistic, something I run into every day because it is an abdication of moral agency to the law. So you say, I don't want to do this, but the law is compelling me to do so, and I have no moral agency. I cannot intervene and say that we find this result to be unjust. This is what the law demands of us, and we have nothing to do but it. It's throwing off your moral agency into some sort of mechanistic, abstract system, which in many ways is far more brutal than the supposed system that came before, where it was just all based on whim.
Yeah, in the liberal legal structure, procedural justice will always trump any kind of moral justice. As long as you followed the right procedure, done things according to the letter, then it's all right.
But that would lead to the situation where you could execute a person you knew to be innocent because they had been validly convicted.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying that's the way that system works.
And I think that is the indictment that we are getting here, is that every bearable human arrangement has to be able to make an exception. The inflexibility and the inability to make exceptions is far more unjust than arbitrariness.
There's a marvelous scene in Trollope's The Warden, which we should do sometime, um, in which the warden is talking to his lawyer in London, and what he really wants is to be vindicated, that the will that created the circumstances in which he lives and the privilege that he enjoys has been correctly interpreted, and therefore he's morally in the right to enjoy all of this privilege. And the lawyer's looking for a very technical legal solution to the problem. And it says, oh, well, this is easy. This is an easy case. We'll win it on a technicality. Don't worry about it. And the warden says, yes, but am I in the right? And the lawyer's just confused. He has no. Why does that matter? What does that have anything to do with it? Because the law doesn't care about that.
Well, that's what Arthur is creating, right? He's trying to create this legal system. And he's running into one of the problems that all creators of such systems have. And he deals with it in terms of right, but I think, or might. But I think we can think of it in terms of, how do you make a legal system such that people don't have to be good? And I don't think you can, right? The framers of our own Constitution wrangled with this in the Federalist Papers. Madison points out, Federalist 15, that, if you had a government composed entirely of angels, you wouldn't need government, right? If people were good, they wouldn't need government at all. And the problem we have is that no government that is sufficiently inflexible to be called a government, so that there are rules that don't change, that are standard, can completely solve the problem of people being wicked. There will always be people who are wicked and who slip through the cracks because they will use the system against itself, or there will be, they'll take advantage of mercy. So what do we do? How do we deal with this? And Arthur is only at the beginning of this.
The mechanism of abstract law is a purely negative force. It can't produce a positive change interiorly.
Exactly.
The musical, I think, does something quite interesting with this, and it's a possible reading of White, but I don't think it's quite clear in White, is that in the musical, Arthur's motivation for creating a more abstract, more detached procedural justice is precisely his need to protect Arthur and Lance from further accusation. He wants to make it harder for anyone to make them guilty or to demonstrate their guilt. And so in the musical, you have all of these challenges that Lance keeps fighting trial by combat over and over and over again. And so the king wants to do away with that, end all of these accusations. No one can make an accusation unless they have enough evidence to indict in a court of law. So the motivation there becomes very personal. That's not quite so clear in White, but I think it's a really interesting interpretation of White.
It is. It gives us a good relief between the development of this story from Mallory all the way to Lerner and Lowe. Because, of course, in Mallory, trial by combat is not. It doesn't go away. It's still there at the end, which is why it is so important for Agravaine and Mordred to catch him in flagrante delicto, right? Then that would obviate the need for trial by combat. It wouldn't simply be their word against his. If they take him with Arthur's knights in the Queen's chamber, no trial by combat is necessary. Trial by combat is used when there's a dispute between people making claims and there's no way to arbitrate them because there are no witnesses. So that's what sets up that particular showdown. In White, it's because there's a different legal system that has been developed. Arthur has created this new legal system about evidence and about making charges in a court and having a trial and being entitled to due process. So that's a very different system. And for them, trial by combat is no longer on the table. It's important to remember this, too, because we see sort of something like trial by combat, or at least the appeal to might as the arbiter of right in both Mallory and in White. But in White, it becomes less explicable because we're supposed to have moved on from that. And that is in the personal combat between Gawain and Lancelot outside of Joyous Gard after Camelot starts to fall apart. So at a structural level in White, that's a little bit peculiar. Like, I thought we'd move beyond this. Why are we doing this? But in Mallory, it's still part of the system, so it makes complete sense. Well, Lancelot and Guinevere are having this romantic scene, a lot of which is about Arthur, incidentally, and I think that's significant. And then Arthur comes in, just as they've been kissing. And one thing I particularly like is that this time the page clattered up the stairs with the usual noise in the way of pages, bringing light and the king, right? He wants to make sure they know he's coming. He doesn't want to actually catch them unawares. This is not an attempt to catch them in the act. So the page is making noise specifically so that they will disentangle themselves. He looked older than either of them, but it was the noble oldness of self-respect, not like Agravaine, who looks old because he's drunk.
The healthy old.
The healthy old. And everyone else looks really well dressed, but not Arthur because he's so plain, gentle and patient, plainly dressed. Mends his own stockings, it even says. Lancelot had found him sitting by himself in a small room mending stockings. Now in his homely blue gown, blue since it was an expensive tincture in those days, was reserved for kings or for saints and angels in pictures. He paused on the threshold of the gleaming room and smiled. Well, Lance? Well, Gwen? How are the Gawains? I like that too, right?
The description of Arthur as not caring about a kingly appearance, a regal pageantry, I think is also really quite important for White, because he wants his Arthur to be a kind of philosopher king who doesn't care about kingship, who really just wants to be good.
He needs to be relatable as an everyman, not so far beyond us that we can't aspire to that.
Well, in this chapter, we get Lancelot and Guinevere asking Arthur the question we'd probably all like to ask him if we've been reading this for the first time. Why don't you do something about Mordred? He hates you, and he wants to destroy your kingdom. Why don't you do something about him? And Arthur explains what might seem inexplicable to us, which is why he protects Mordred. And that is that he kind of understands him. He admits that when he was 19, they frightened me with horrible prophecies, and I did something which has haunted me ever since. That is to say, he put Mordred in a boat and floated it out to sea. All the children born at a certain time were to be put in a big ship and floated out to sea. I wanted to destroy Mordred for his own sake, and I didn't know where he would be born. Did they do it? Yes. The ship was floated off, and Mordred was on it, and it was wrecked on an island. Most of the poor babies were drowned, but God saved Mordred and sent him back to shame me afterwards.
There's a bit of I don't know if it's maybe a kind of retconning or if it's Arthur's memory not being reliable. But when Arthur says the famous Cornwall sisters, there were 3 daughters by a former earl, and of course, though I did not know it, they were my half-sisters. They were called Morgan le Fay, Elaine, and Morgause, and they were considered to be the most beautiful women in Britain. Well, when we met Morgan le Fay in Sword in the Stone, she was hardly beautiful. She was obese, hardly able to move.
In her giant castle of food, right?
Right. Yes. And then he says, I fell in love with Morgause and we had a baby. Well, that's not what we saw depicted. What we saw depicted was a trick.
Yeah, she entranced him for an evening.
Yeah.
Was Morgan Le Fay one of the episodes that was omitted when he rewrote The Sword and the Stone?
No,
Or is it just the sorceress duel with Merlin?
just the sorceress duel, Madame Mim.
Yeah,
doesn't
Madame
make
Mim,
it
that's
through.
right.
Yeah. So Lancelot says,
Wait, do we think Arthur is misremembering or painting a picture that's more convenient to, a story that's more convenient to tell, or is White retconning?
no, I don't think he's retconning. I think this is just how Arthur remembers it, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe Arthur can't imagine sexual relations with someone that he doesn't love. And so he says, well, I must have fallen in love with her then, right? That must be what happened. It's been a long time.
Or he's just being maximally charitable to everyone.
Yeah. It wasn't sneaky, weird sorceress enchantment rape. It was, I fell in love with her. That's what it was. And that frees her from sort of any guilt. And
That frees him.
Lancelot, who hears all this, that Mordred intends, really, wants to upset his kingdom. And of course, the implication is therefore Lancelot and Gwen could be the means to do that. So please don't do anything that would give him evidence. Lancelot's response is, why don't you just cut his head off? And I think a lot of us, probably exasperated with the situation and aware of what a threat Mordred is, might feel the same way. Why not just kill him? Just kill him and be done with it. You're the king, right? No. I could never think of it. You forget that Mordred is my son. I am fond of him. All of this is verbatim in Camelot, by the way. I have done the boy a great deal of wrong, and my family has always somehow been hurting the Cornwalls, and I couldn't add to the wickedness. Besides, I am his father. I can see myself in him. And Lancelot says, there does not seem to be a great resemblance. But there is. Mordred is ambitious and fond of honor, as I always was. It is only because he has a weak body that he has failed in our sports, and this has embittered him, as it probably would have embittered me if I had not been lucky. He is brave, too, in a queer way, and he is loyal to his people. You see, his mother set him against me, which was natural, and I stand for the bad things in his mind. He is almost sure to get me killed in the end. Lancelot says, you're seriously advancing this as a reason for not killing him now? The king suddenly looked surprised or shocked. He had been sitting relaxed between them because he was tired and unhappy, yet now he drew himself up and met his captain in the eye. You must remember I am the King of England. When you are a king, you can't go executing people as the fancy takes you. A king is the head of his people, and he must stand as an example to them and do as they wish. If only someone had told this to Henry VIII. It would have been a happier time. Can't just kill
Henry
people.
VIII always got a legal conviction before he.
Yeah, that's right. It's witchcraft, right? Yeah, that's what it was. Witchcraft.
I think Arthur and Lancelot are both here for getting the best possible solution for situations like this when you have inconvenient sons. That's what the church is for.
Bishop. Make him a bishop.
Make him a bishop.
I don't know that Bishop Mordred is the solution, Drew.
He wouldn't be worse than plenty of medieval bishops.
That's unfortunately absolutely true.
Right. Could he be worse than Cesare Borgia?
Well, so Arthur goes along to the court of pleas. This is, I think, one of the episodes in this book where he's most like Merlin. He does Merlin's job, right? And Lancelot takes the place of the young wart. He just doesn't understand. Why don't you just kill people? Why don't you just cut his head off? What do you mean you like him? Well, he's my son, and Arthur, like Merlin all those years ago, tries to understand why people do things and what their motivations are, and to evaluate them along those lines, rather than just, are they inconvenient to me? Rather than purely instrumental lines. Right? Instrumentally is how Lancelot views Mordred, right? And as an instrument, he's dangerous. He's a threat to the court. He upsets the stability of the realm. For Lancelot, who's charged with defending all those things, the solution is clear. Get rid of him. Lancelot has no commitment to the law. He's not interested in that. He's not interested in any particular political system. He just wants stability at the court. And the best way to do that is to get rid of Mordred. But if you're concerned about how do we keep this system together, then you have to take a different view, as Arthur does.
Well, it's not just one motivation for Arthur. I mean, I think that it's both his commitment to the abstract system of justice that he has set up and his personal affection for his son. I mean, he feels a paternal obligation there.
Well, chapter 5 is the proximate cause. This is what brings down the kingdom. Chapter 5. Rumor and noise, Mallory says, and 2 unhappy knights. Arthur is in the justice room. And the justice room, White says in a delightful line, is not as empty as it should have been. It should just have had the king in it, because that would mean that justice has been done and nothing needs to be redressed. But there are people in the justice room. 5 people waiting for the king. 5 Orkney boys. And they're still arguing. Gawain is trying to convince them. For the last time, Agravaine, will you hold your gab? I winna have ert nor part in it. Nor will I, said Gareth. Gaheris said, nor I. So the split is still there. If you press on with it, you will but split the clan. I have told you plain that none of us will help ye. You will be left to your ain stir. And Mordred had been waiting with sneering patience to say, I am on Agravaine's side. Lancelot and my aunt are a disgrace to all of us. Agravaine and I will take the responsibility if no one else will. It's not about their petty vengeances, although in Mallory it absolutely is. They have a privy hate, is what Mallory says, the phrase he uses. And we've seen that privy hate in chapter 1 here, right? White lays it out for us. They're not really motivated by the disgrace caused to the court by Guinevere and Lancelot. They're motivated by their own private desires for vengeance. You or I fit for a work of shame, says Gareth, to which Mordred replies, thank you. You were ever fit for shameful deeds. That's what you're made to do. Oh, thank you very much. So they have this argument. And they try once more to make the case for indicting Lancelot and Guinevere. And they fail. Once again. Gawain storms out, pushing Gaheris before him and followed by Gareth. And the king walks over. And this leaves the king with Mordred and Agravaine. And Arthur's speech here is excellent. I want to jump to the lines where they start to make the... Arthur reminds them about Sir Meliagrance first. You know, hint, hint. This could happen to you. But Agravaine and Mordred, smiling, press their case. And the king says this. Well, Mordred, we had better not start wrangling about smaller things. I have no longer the resistance to be rude about them. You tell me that my wife is the mistress of my best friend, and apparently you are to prove this by demonstration. So let us stick to that. I take it that you understand the implications of the charge. No, I do not. I am sure that Agravaine will, at all events. The implications are these. If you insist on a civil proof instead of an appeal to the court of honor, the matter will go forward along the lines of civil proof. Should you establish your case, the man who saved you both from Sir Turquine will have his head cut off, and my wife, whom I love very much, will have to be burned alive for treason. Should you fail to establish your case, I must warn you that I should banish you, Mordred, which would deprive you of all hope of succession, such as it is, while I should condemn Agravaine to the stake in his turn, because by making the accusation he would himself have committed treason. Everybody knows that we could establish our case at once. Very well, Agravaine. You are a keen lawyer, and you are determined to have the law. I suppose it is no good reminding you that there is such a thing as mercy. The kind of mercy, asked Mordred, which used to set those babies adrift in boats? Thank you, Mordred. I was forgetting. We do not want mercy, said Agravaine. We want justice. Justice without mercy. It's pretty terrible. And at every step here, and it continues, Arthur desperately tries to convince them to choose a different route. Don't do this. Imagine he appeals to their self-interest, which is wise because that is what motivates them. And it isn't enough.
Well, it's Arthur's own fault for having set up a legal system, apparently on his own authority alone, in which the only mandatory punishment for treason is to be burnt alive at the stake. I mean, if he set up the rules, why didn't he have a more merciful sentencing option?
The plan
that actually is an interesting legal question, and kind of what happened with our federal sentencing system. So back before we adopted the federal sentencing guidelines, the problem was different judges would have different sentences for different things. In particular, in the South, as you might imagine, there were harsher sentences for a certain group of people, and not so harsh sentences for others. And so Congress, in their infinite wisdom, decided that what we were going to do is we're going to remove that discretion, and we're going to create this mechanistic sentencing table, and we're going to assign you a number of points based on what you did, and those points will go up or down based on these other factors, and at the end, judges will perform a mathematical calculation, and that will give them a sentence that is fair. And what we observed empirically in that is that sentences got uniformly more harsh under the supposedly fair sentencing guidelines because you restricted the ability of good men and women to be merciful when the situation warranted it. By restricting discretion, you actually make the system much more harsh.
Yeah. By trying to create a mechanized legal solution to what was a moral problem, they ended up making the situation worse in different ways.
Right. And I think that Arthur is equally as culpable here because as I talked about in the last one, when you assign the moral valence of your system to the system itself and say it's not me, it's the system, that's an act of moral cowardice. That's a refusal to engage something as a person of reason.
Right. It's refusing to recognize that systems are made by humanity for human purposes, right? It's acting as if, oh, that's just the way things are. We didn't make it that way. Well, yes, you did.
Yes.
In fact, in Arthur's case, you made it that way just yesterday.
Yeah, deliberately, right?
Well, and if you want to look at it from a truly mechanistic perspective, you can go to Kurt Gödel. And we know that no system can be both, consistent and coherent. And so at some point you have to realize that systems, by their very nature, cannot take into account everything, and you have to have some sort of safety valve or pressure valve there. And that's exactly what Arthur could create in this situation.
I think the problem he has is that he's being thwarted by Mordred and Agravaine, right? Who would call out any such safety valve as a betrayal of the system itself. And they'd say, oh, it's one rule for you and one rule for us. So this is the problem of the Revolutionary Party. And they want him to be involved, right? And that's what the concluding pages of this chapter are about. Yes, you can bring these charges, but you need evidence. And they say, well, then you'll have to entrap your wife, right? You'll have to pretend to go away, but not go away. And then he says, well, no, that's actually outside of justice. I'm not required to participate in this. In fact, it wouldn't be right. I think it would be very just to say that the onus of proof lies with you. Yes, I think that is just. Clearly, I have the right to refuse to become, well, a sort of accomplice. It is not part of my duty to go away on purpose in order to help you. No, I should be able to refuse to do that with a clear heart. You can see him kind of like working through it in his own sentences, right? Yes, no, that's right. As Merlin taught him to do. He's reasoning through his participation. But Mordred and Agravaine say, well, you can't refuse to never go away again. You can't just be a shield to them and, spend your life chained to the queen or purpose to keep Lancelot away. What about the hunting party you're supposed to go on? If you don't go on that, you'll be altering your plans deliberately so as to thwart justice. And Arthur says, nobody succeeds in thwarting justice, Agravaine. Which can only be true in a metaphysical sense, right?
Of course it's true all the time.
People succeed in thwarting worldly justice, but I think Arthur must mean something else. But they miss it, of course. And he does agree that he will go, and he won't warn anyone beforehand. The elation in his voice was so indecent that even Mordred was disgusted. Agravaine ginning himself up. The man's voice tripped over itself with excitement. You won't warn them after we have made the accusation? It wouldn't be fair. Fair, he asked. He looked at them from an immense distance, seeming to weigh truth, justice, evil, and the affairs of men. You have our permission. No I this time. He said I the entire time. He's only ever said I and me. But here it's the royal we. You have our permission. His eyes came back from the distance, fixing them personally with a falcon's gleam. But if I may speak for a moment, Mordred and Agravaine, as a private person, notice the I, the private person, the only hope I now have left is that Lancelot will kill you both and all the witnesses, a feat which, I am proud to say, has never been beyond my Lancelot's power. And I may add this also as a minister of justice, that if you fail for one moment in establishing this monstrous accusation, I shall pursue you both remorselessly with all the rigor of the laws which you yourselves have set in motion. Oh, if only. But that's not what happens. And we know because we read Mallory. And they do get him in flagrante delicto. And he is unarmed. But we saw Lancelot fight Meleagant with no shield and no helm and no armor, with one arm tied behind his back. And he still cut him in half. You think he's going to...
And did a miracle right afterwards.
Yeah, and then he did a miracle to heal Sir Uri. You think he's going to have any problem with Mordred and Agravaine? I mean, come on. Come on. Well, that's it for this week.
I like the degree to which this sort of prefigures our modern search and seizure law. That we don't allow someone just to burst in and invade someone's privacy. You have to have the sovereign's permission to do so. You have to have the sovereign's permission to keep it a secret from them. Mm-hmm. And even then, it prefigures the remedy for that. If that's violated, then you yourself, the supposed agents of the law, are now subject to the law.
Brought to book. Exactly. Remorselessly, right? Pursued Well, I don't know if they're pursued remorselessly.
I wish it was
they
that
were pursued remorselessly.
Yes.
Yeah, right. It's not quite how it works. But we don't have Arthurs everywhere. Well, that's it for this week. I really
not
like
Arthurs anywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's the once and future king, Drew. Maybe tomorrow. I really like those closing pages. I think Arthur has done everything he can with his own fixation on mercy to give Mordred and Agravaine every possible way out. And they still have a way out. Having made this charge to him and said that we're going to go get evidence, they don't have to pursue it. They could think better of it. You know, as the next day or two unfolds, they could realize that there's too much to risk. Mordred will be king one day, right? What's the point of risking it all? Arthur is an old man. Just let it go. So he's done everything he can to persuade them. Only invincible vengeance, an invincible desire to avenge yourself on somebody else will keep you going. And that is unfortunately what fills the hearts of Mordred and Agravaine. Invincible vengeance and no mercy whatsoever. Well, with that, we have just 2 more weeks left. Next week, we'll see the outcome. What will happen when Mordred and Agravaine carry out their plan? Will Lancelot kill all the knights and all the witnesses like Arthur hopes they will? He even admits it. I hope. My only hope is that Lancelot will kill everyone involved. There's a beautiful moment of frankness there. He admits that it's going to happen, that Arthur is having an affair with his wife. He admits that he hopes that Lancelot will frustrate justice, kill the accusers. It's an incredible moment, actually, on a variety of levels. What will happen? Tune in next week to find out. And in the meantime, why not head to Critical Readings and click Become a Supporter at the top of the page. We'll send you an invite to our supporters only Discord channel, where we put the podcast up as soon as it's edited to get early access. You can watch it actually being recorded live, and you can participate in our discussions and our votes for our Reader's Choice episodes, one of which is coming up in just a few weeks. So do check that out, and we'll put your name in the credits for as long as you're a supporter. Thank you also to this week to my co-hosts. They are Lane Haygood.
Goodbye as always.
And Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene.
It's been a pleasure.
That's it for us. But we'll be back next week with the second of 3 parts of The Candle in the Wind by T.H. White. Until then, from all of us here at Critical Readings, Godspeed.